The naming of a special envoy to the AES by President John Dramani Mahama reflects a deep commitment. Ghana recognizes, understands, and shares in this sentiment. They once told us it could never occur. They claimed Ghana Western diplomacy's favorite, a symbol of ECOWAS stability. Would never side with revolutionaries, would never deviate from the IMF track, would never appear beside Ibrahim Traoré. Yet, in July 2025, the unimaginable took shape. Ghana, once labeled the doorway to Africa by European investors and American strategists, crossed a boundary, not quietly or covertly, but openly, standing shoulder to shoulder with nations the West had long condemned as the axis of coups. This was not just diplomatic theater, it was a geopolitical tremor. A new narrative was being written not in Paris or Washington, but in Ouagadougou. And if even Ghana was now turning away from the old script, then the pressing question becomes, who is next? Follow Spirit of Africa, because the world no longer views Africa from the skies, it watches as Africa ascends from within. It was no rumor on the breeze or hush-hush note tucked into diplomatic cables. It was a public declaration. In late June 2025, Ghana's Ministry of Foreign Affairs shocked the continent with a formal statement. The Republic of Ghana would engage in complete security and economic collaboration with the Sahel Alliance, Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad. What had previously been dismissed as a last resort pact now carried a different title in certain circles, the Future Bloc. The language was resolute. Ghana joined not as a bystander but as a full-fledged partner, sovereign state choosing to stand not with donor summits or overseas military posts, but with an alliance shaping its security internally and developing its economy from the grassroots. The message reached Paris. It signaled Washington. It jolted Abuja, because Ghana was not only entering something new, it was exiting something broken. The illusion that ECOWAS still held regional authority, but this wasn't merely a partnership, it was a proclamation. And that proclamation asked one thing of all Africans: what side of history will you stand on? For years, Ghana was celebrated as the ideal, a democracy that functioned, West African country that achieved the improbable, credible elections, expanding middle class and rising foreign investment. Western leaders would gesture toward Africa and say, this is the standard. But beneath the headlines and figures, fractures were forming. Imported products overwhelmed domestic agriculture. Youth abandoned rural communities. The city struggled under the strain of a dot system. Aid packages came wrapped in conditions. Scripted not in Ghana's parliament but in distant corporate boardrooms nowhere near Kumasi to Mali, or the People's Pulse. Even the model had grown weary of pretending. So, when Ghana's leadership stepped forward in June 2025 to announce its alliance with AES, it wasn't diving into disorder, it was returning to truth. It was reviving a question long buried. What does true sovereignty in Africa look like? In Ouagadougou, the news didn't filter through official reports or foreign media, it echoed through whispers, reactions, and stunned conversation. Tea stalls buzzed. Student dorms ignited. Even the elders, whose long lives made them hard to surprise, sat silent by their radios and slowly nodded. Ghana had joined Ghana, the same nation that once chanted ECOWAS slogans. Ghana, whose peacekeepers once deployed under the UN to Liberia. Ghana, which hosted US military drills, had now committed to the so-called isolated trio. But in Burkina Faso, no one used that phrase anymore. They called them brothers. Western voices often described African democracy like a lone best, managed and overseen. Ghana was their showcase, a venue for summits, a door open to foreign capital. Yet the more Ghana was praised, the more its citizens were silenced. Farmers in the Volta region had long warned imported seeds. External agriculture firms and climate instability were turning them into laborers on their own soil. Fresh graduates in Cape Coast struggled to launch businesses in a decaying system, and the diaspora many left proud, but carried guilt for leaving behind the home they still loved. So when Burkina Faso expelled foreign forces, Western commentators mocked. When Traoré turned down IMF funding, they labeled him reckless. But when Ghana, coastal, democratic English-speaking nation with strategic ports, followed suit, the mockery ended and the world paid attention. This was not an act of generosity. Ghana didn't join AES to rescue anyone. Ghana joined because it recognized its future emerging elsewhere. The Sahel Alliance, once framed as a desperate cluster, had started laying real foundations: a military academy, a unified education system, a bold vision seeking no foreign approval, and the global balance began to tip. Development was no longer judged by how many embassies you hosted or how much aid you collected, but by the control you had over your harvests, your land, your currency, and your direction. That was the choice Ghana made, and by doing so it compelled the continent to face a hard reality. If Ghana could leave the table, perhaps the feast was never truly meant for us. In Burkina Faso, the moment felt almost spiritual. For years, we were ridiculed. Every time we rejected the CFA franc, restricted foreign media, or created our own northern patrols, we were met with scorn. They labeled us rebels, fantasists, impoverished. But now, the country that once embodied the correct way had moved in our direction. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like peace because we were no longer shouting into silence. Ghana stood with us, not out of obligation, but by deliberate choice, because it saw beyond headlines and fear, and recognized what we'd seen all along, a continent prepared to create its own terms again. If Ghana could walk away from the safety of external praise and still hold its head high, if it could exchange approval for purpose, then maybe we must all ask ourselves, what are we still afraid of? And more urgently, what are we still waiting for? Throughout the region, a ripple was felt across African legislative halls. If Ghana could say no, what might Senegal choose? If the AES could embrace Ghana, what could Gambia, Togo, or Guinea imagine? Suddenly, the idea of a united, independent Africa stopped being a theory. It had a banner, a shoreline, and now, a precedent. For the first time, the story began to shift not from presidential speeches, but from community centers, not in white papers, but in dialogue. Because if Ghana could step down from its donor-made pedestal and stand with landlocked resistors of the Sahel, then anything became possible. Dignity, rebirth, even freedom. So when Ghana moved beyond the blurry boundary, separating what was acceptable from what was authentic, it did more than change its own future. It made Africa examine itself. And following that turning point came the vision that inspired it all. The quiet strategist, once dismissed as too young, too extreme, too ambitious, Ibrahim Traoré. Many believed Ghana's shift was abrupt, that Traoré had stumbled into it, but those paying close attention understood better. This moment was not random. It was not built by decree or conquest, but by discipline, steady and grounded. As the world labeled the Sahel chaotic, Traoré was laying something deeper than alliances. He was crafting a doctrine. And like everything in Burkina Faso, didn't begin with noise, it began with necessity. Between Arling Arsene and Arling Awu, Traoré worked silently. No flashy global appearances, no speeches begging donors for help. He focused on weaving quiet connections beneath the radar of international indifference. He started by uniting Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso with small, precise steps: joint patrol missions, shared intelligence, food aid to Niger during the ECOWAS sanctions. No headlines, no press releases, only actions. Every plan stemmed from a single question: can we defend ourselves without needing permission? The answer came in the shape of the Ouagadougou Military Academy. It wasn't a foreign base or a donation from abroad, it was a homegrown institution for training AES officers. Under a new creed: protect the people first, the borders second. No imported training manuals, no outside doctrine, just one belief: sovereignty begins from within. Next came education, not a tweak, but a cleansing. The old textbooks printed in Brussels and written in Paris were discarded. Replacing them was a curriculum shaped by the region's own scholars, farmers, and visionaries. Students learned the real story of the Sahel. They were taught agroecology, local defense, and the teachings of Sankara, Nkrumah, and Lumumba. They learned how to survive drought, not from theory, but from ancestral wisdom passed down orally. They were no longer trained to fit into someone else's world, they were being prepared to rebuild their own. This was more than schooling, it was a movement. And Traoré didn't stop there. Knowing that revolutions can't last without food, he initiated the Ecological Consortia Zones, a trinational system where seeds, land, labor, and irrigation were shared, not bought or sold. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began mapping crop cycles together, sharing more than produce, sharing purpose. Yet they remained landlocked, their borders fragile, still cast aside by global analysts, until Ghana arrived. With Ghana came maritime access. With Ghana, the consortia zones could finally export directly, bypassing ECOWAS middlemen, avoiding CFA-tied ports. The AES didn't just gain a new member, it opened an economic floodgate, and what once seemed improbably so, West African core began to feel inevitable. Thanks to Ghana's advanced digital systems, AES launched a regional payment network. No more dollar dependency, no more foreign-controlled gateways. Now, direct cross-border payments using national currencies became a reality. Ghana supplied the pilot infrastructure, Burkina Faso contributed its gold and grain, Niger brought energy, Mali offered the land, and Ouagadougou became the mind, the policy center, the strategic core. A nation once defined by fragility had transformed into the steady motor of a regional shift. What they were creating had no Western match. It wasn't the EU, it wasn't the Gulf bloc, it wasn't BRICS. It was something African. Each country carried a responsibility, each had a voice, and none waited for approval. That's why it was called the Sahel Tiger Strategy, not because it roared, but because it moved with intent, hidden beneath poverty, fortified by solidarity, and crafted to outlive disorder. When Ghana joined, the vision gained recognition. No longer rebellion, no longer a desperate move by landlocked states. Ghana brought democracy. Ghana brought access to the sea. Ghana brought trust in Washington, Brussels, and Addis Ababa. Its entry made the AES impossible to ignore. Analysts who once mocked Traoré began reviewing his speeches. Global institutions stopped calling AES a risky bloc and began wondering whether this was the model for Africa's future. Yet Traoré never raised his voice. He didn't boast. He never declared victory. When asked what Ghana's membership meant for the AES, he simply replied, "We do not need to conquer anyone. We only need to be strong enough for others to choose to stand on our side." That sentence said it all. ECOWAS wasn't an empire. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a choice, a blueprint, a reflection. And for the people of Burkina Faso, told they were too weak, too poor, too broken, it was a moment of breath, of belief, of finally raising their heads, because now, they were not dreaming alone. But as the new reality began to take form, the old one began to shake. Far from the Sahel in Abuja and Abidjan, in Paris a quiet unease took hold. Then came the backlash. It started softly. There were no statements, no televised outrage, just silence. And that silence carried tension. In Abuja, ECOWAS officials met in closed-door sessions. No journalists were allowed, no live stream. Only one question filled the room. What happens now that Ghana, the final balance in our structure, has crossed over? Behind thick walls, voices clashed. Some called for sanctions, others pushed for diplomatic distancing. But the truth was unavoidable. Ghana wasn't a peripheral state. It wasn't Mali. It wasn't Niger. It wasn't even Burkina Faso. Ghana was respected. Ghana had global partnerships. Ghana had trade ties with Brussels, agreements with Washington, and credibility with the African Union. And now, it had broken ranks. Within hours, the ECOWAS Secretariat in Abuja drafted a classified memo to Accra. The tone was cold. Continued collaboration with the Sahel Alliance would lead to a review of current trade, financial and investment benefits. This, they said, was about principle. In clear terms, the message was, pull back or pay the price. But Ghana did not retreat. No government counterstatement, no dramatic press briefing. Only one sentence from a foreign ministry spokesperson. Our country will not make decisions out of pressure, but out of our belief in a resilient West Africa. That quiet defiance hit harder than any fiery speech. In Ouagadougou, it echoed like a storm. For the first time, the people of Burkina Faso no longer saw Ghana as a visitor in their movement, but as a partner prepared to sacrifice for it. And that changed everything. In cafes and classrooms, on dirt roads and airwaves, one message spread: we are no longer fighting alone. Still, the world was not ready to release its hold. In Paris, newspaper columns labeled it a strategic earthquake. French analysts, once dismissive of the AES, hurried to revise their forecasts. The West's most reliable ally in West Africa had gone off script. In Washington, the quiet concern turned into full recalibration. The IMF began reassessing its financial packages. US-funded infrastructure programs were paused, pending alignment reviews. European investors postponed major development projects in Accra not because Ghana had failed, but because it had chosen a direction they hadn't authorized. Ghana called it sovereignty. The West called it rebellion. But Traoré called it readiness. Weeks after the League, in a private summit with no cameras, no flags, and no anthems, the leaders of Ghana, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso met in Ouagadougou. There was only one shared understanding. They were now at war with dependence, not a war with weapons, but a war against the old order, financial, political, ideological. At that summit, Burkina Faso took a decisive step. Traoré proposed the creation of a sovereign defense funder, regional financial buffer, underwritten by the bloc's gold reserves and agricultural surplus. Its purpose: if one member faced attack through sanctions, aid cuts, or economic isolation, the fund would activate an internal rescue fund. Fuel loans not from the IMF, but from within. Ghana didn't hesitate. Not only did they agree, they offered something transformative. Ghana proposed sharing their digital payment system, a system tested over years to allow AES countries to bypass the dollar, bypass the CFA franc, and even bypass SWIFT in crucial bilateral transactions. It was a revolutionary gesture. Suddenly, AES was no longer just a political bloc. It had become a financial firewall. A journalist in Accra said it best: this isn't just a partnership, this is an immune system. West Africa is building its own immune system, but with every step forward, pressure mounted behind closed doors. Diplomatic cables flew. Threats cloaked in politeness. Offers disguised as compromise. Ghana's leaders were warned: reconsider or lose everything. And yet Accra didn't blink, and Ouagadougou stood firmer. Because something had shifted, not just in policy but in people. In the north of Burkina Faso, in the dust-covered region of Kaya, where children still study by lantern light and grandmothers whisper prayers over bowls of millet porridge, something unexpected appeared. An old wooden cross. Not a monument, not a shrine, but a symbol. At its base lay a schoolbook, but not a Bible. It was a newly printed Sahel history textbook, issued only weeks earlier as part of the New Books, New Land program. Inside the first page, someone had written in red ink, "If God gave us the desert, it was so we could learn to turn it into a garden." No one knew who wrote it, but everyone knew what it meant. Because the war they were fighting was no longer against men, it was against despair. And Ghana's choice to stay or hold the line cracked something deep in the African psyche. A fear lifted, a silence broke. And in the place where doubt once lived, something ancient began to awaken. Not rebellion, not vengeance, but identity. A belief that we no longer have to ask, that we no longer have to explain, that this continent battered and bloodied is rising, not because it was permitted to, but because its children have decided. It can end now with the world watching, with alliances shifting and a new architecture taking root. The question is no longer, will the old order collapse? The question is, what will take its place? When the dust settled, something remarkable emerged from the storm. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a headline. It was a quiet understanding shared between farmers, students, economists, and elders that something irreversible had occurred. The map had changed. For years, West Africa was drawn with invisible lines, some shaped by language, some by trade, most by control. Coastal nations held the power. Landlocked nations bore the burden. Those with ports dictated the pace. Those without waited for permission. But now, a new kind of balance was taking form. Not one imposed from above, one negotiated from within. In this emerging reality, Ghana became the gateway not for foreign capital, but for an African trade corridor designed by Africans, for Africans. Accra managed logistics, maritime flow, and coastal entry. The ports once dominated by systems built in Europe were now serving an African-driven economy, and in the heart of the continent, where the soil is dry but the mines are rich, Burkina Faso was no longer the waiting room of history. It had become the center, the policy hub, the forge of educational reform, the keeper of the shared vision, not because it was richer, not because it was stronger, but because it was ready to believe that identity could be a compass, not just a scar. From that belief came the Sahel-Ghana Inter-Academic Network, a bold new education exchange that allowed students from Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Ghana to study across borders, share expertise, and learn in their own languages, through their own lived realities. No more colonial curriculums, no more distant diplomas. In their place, agroecology, solar engineering, dryland management, lessons from lived experience, not PowerPoint slides flown in from Geneva. For once, education wasn't preparation for export. It was preparation for home, and it didn't stop there. Each country took its role: Mali the shield, the provider of regional security, the guardian against incursion; Niger the fire, with uranium and solar fields powering the bloc from within; Ghana the window, diplomatic, maritime, a source of soft power and global leverage; and Burkina Faso the pulse, the heart of ideas, the guardian of cohesion, the one that reminded the bloc, we did not win because we were big, we won because we were ready to be true. This was not just strategy, it was symbiosis, a model not copied from China, or the EU, or the Gulf, but one that emerged from the land like a seed that had waited years for rain. Regional analysts began calling it the Sahel Tiger model, but in the tea houses of Bobo-Dioulasso, in the classrooms of Koudougou, in the quiet exchanges between border guards and school teachers, it had no name, it was simply ours. And for the first time, West Africans stopped measuring success by how many aid packages they received. They measured it by how little they needed to ask, because something deeper had taken root, not infrastructure, not policy, but trust. And if a child in Kaya can now open a history book and find their story written in their mother's tongue, in their father's fields, in their grandmother's prayers, then maybe, just maybe, this is no longer a borrowed future. Maybe it is the beginning of something sacred. Something we no longer defend with apology, but with conviction. And still, the world watches. But in the homes of those once forgotten, in the hearts of those long told they were behind, a new question is rising, not from fear, but from faith. If this is only the beginning, what kind of fire will burn next? It did not begin with a flag, nor with an anthem. It began with a whisper. In Kaya, a town choked by dust and drought, where the sun burns even after it sets and the wind carries more sand than news, a strange sight appeared on a dry hill. An old wooden cross. It stood alone. No plaque, no guards, no crowd at its base. Not a Bible, but a book. A newly printed Sahel children's history textbook, fresh from Burkina Faso's reformed curriculum. The first page lay open. In red ink, someone had written, "If God gave us the desert, it was so we could learn to turn it into a garden." No one knew who placed it there. No one needed to, because the meaning was already moving through the people like wildfire. Ghana's entry into AES was not just geopolitics. It was a signal, a sacred one, a sign that Africa was no longer rising through rage, but through knowledge, through solidarity, and something even deeper, faith in itself. In Ouagadougou, students began forming study circles around old Sahel stories. In Tamale, Ghana, farmers started rewriting crop rotation guides based on Malian soil knowledge. In Bamako, young officers began studying Burkinab texts on psychological warfare, not for conquest, but for community defense. The fire had spread, not as violence, but as memory, as reclamation, as dignity, no longer borrowed but reborn. And across the continent, the story was no longer told by diplomats, not by generals, not even by presidents, but by mothers telling children. The map is changing, by fathers saying, "We are no longer waiting. by grandparents whispering, "I never thought I would live to see this day," and by young people finally declaring, "I no longer need to leave to matter." For the people of Burkina Faso, this shift was spiritual. For too long, we were told that hope only came in planes and grants that landed in agreements signed by strangers. Now we know better. Hope comes from within, from how we teach, from how we plant, from how we believe. And if tomorrow this experiment fails, if aid is cut, if markets close, if pressure mounts again, we will not return to silence, because we have heard something that cannot be unheard. We have felt something that cannot be undone. And above all, we now walk with someone we never believed would walk with us. Ghana did not just bring ports and power. Ghana brought confirmation that we are not crazy, that we are not alone, that we are not poor in spirit. We are building something real, and this time no one else gets to name it. So if your child asks you one day, what was the moment Africa began to change, tell them, it was not a battle, not a treaty, not a headline. It was a choice made by a nation that once sat at the table of the powerful only to stand up and walk toward its brothers, toward the dry soil, toward the forgotten border, toward home. And now, before you leave this page, let me ask you, if you had to explain this moment to your children, what would you say? Would you call it politics, or would you call it a resurrection? A moment when Africans stopped asking for entry and began writing the gate themselves. Leave a line, a thought, a blessing, a prayer right here in the comments, because you may never know whose child in the Sahel will one day read your words and realize that they were never abandoned. They were born in the fire, and the fire has only just begun.